Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you all. The backstory about when I first became interested in assisted dying, I was doing my PhD when the legislation passed in Canada. And I looked around and saw that there were physicians, including Stephanie Green and Tanya Dawes and Ellen Weep, who were doing the important work of actually doing the MAID provisions and then talking and writing about their experiences. I also saw that there were people like Jocelyn Downey who were using their legal expertise to actually fight for the rights of Canadians to access medical assistance in dying. And so I did realize, though, that there was one vacancy, and that's how I came to dedicate my life to arguing with people on the internet. So Stephanie has mentioned that that I kind of like to offer taxonomies. If you don't have to spend very much time looking at arguments both for and against assisted dying to realize that there's actually just a huge number of them, and specifically with objections that jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that you kind of go through the same cycle and new ones continually pop up. So it has this feeling of kind of whack-a-mole arguments that you respond to one and then there's some new point that people come up with. But if you zoom out a bit, you'll see that there's actually some themes connecting them, and that's what I want to talk about, kind of one that, this is a second stage one, so this is an argument that's kind of objection to MAID that we still see fairly frequently in Canada, and that you've read about if you hear stories from Canada, but that is actually kind of, I think, a mistake. So in artificial intelligence, there's something called the black box problem. And this is the problem that large language models and machine learning algorithms, that if you talk to ChatGPT or if you play chess with the computer or whatever, that they can do incredible stuff. Tell you which chess move to make, tell you even about a diagnosis for a medical condition. But if you then try to figure out why it gave you that particular answer, that it can't really explain it. It might, if you're talking to ChatGPT, it'll say, oh, here's the justification, but that's not actually what it's doing. It's really just connecting different nodes kind of behind the surface, or under the surface. And the problem with this is that there's an issue about justification, that we want to know not just what the answer is, how you got to that answer, but we want to make sure that it's justified. We know that with machine learning algorithms that they can call, they do what's called hallucinating, that they can kind of get to the wrong answer, but it feels like it's convincing. And I think that there's a similar problem that happens with one particular type of objection to MAID. And it goes like this. The first premise, or usually the only premise that you hear about, is that there exist vulnerable people. And the conclusion that they get is that MAID should be illegal or completely banned. But if you're in the argument business, like I am, and you want to know what are the other premises that connect that premise to that conclusion, there's a black box. They don't say, they take it to be obvious. And it's not to say that there's no way, there are no premises that you could come up with or explanations that you could give. But it is to say that you should be on guard for when you encounter claims about vulnerability being used to justify or argue for complete bans, because I think that they are, in fact, unjustified. So vulnerability, that it can come up in a lot of different circumstances. There can be vulnerability due to poverty or due to homelessness or due to incarceration or due to disability. But in general, the kind of concern that there is about vulnerability is that people will make an inauthentic choice. They might not have capacity, or they might be coerced, or they might be unduly influenced in one way or another. And it is undeniable that there are, in fact, vulnerable people. And so my argument today is not to say that this isn't something that we need to worry about. They certainly exist, and they certainly they require our attention when we're thinking about assisted dying and what the appropriate criteria and safeguards should be. But the fact that there are vulnerable people does not, for one, mean that such people cannot make authentic choices on their own or cannot do their own decision-making. And the suggestion that somebody is unable to make their own choices or to decide authentically because of, say, their socioeconomic status or because of having a disability is, I think, a false one. It's also the case that merely having the risk of something, in vulnerability, that it doesn't follow from that that a ban would be warranted. So you can think about assisted dying with a metaphor that the criteria that we have in Canada, that you have to have decision-making capacity and that you have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition and so on, that's the same as like getting access to the beach to be able to go swimming or to be able to go surfing. And then the safeguards that we've put in place are things like the equivalent of having a lifeguard stand or lifelines available. That there are ways that we can mitigate risk or address risk, recognizing that it's going to be present, that we can't completely eliminate it. Or the only way we could completely eliminate it would be with a ban, but that would, as many others have already spoken about today, get it too far in the other direction and would be wrong. In Carter, the Supreme Court of Canada decision, which is a unanimous decision, and it was the decision that struck down the general prohibition on assisted dying in Canada in 2015. They actually looked at the concept of vulnerability. This was a key part of their analysis in their decision. And they noticed two things. The first one is that, first of all, not all people seeking medical assistance in dying are in fact vulnerable, however you want to define vulnerability. And so a complete ban just because of the presence of vulnerable people would be unjustified. But more importantly, they looked at what the lower court judge that brought the kind of case, the decision that ended up going to the Supreme Court, that she had surveyed data from around the world at that time. And this is from the Carter decision, so they're kind of summarizing it. And they say that the evidence from Oregon and the Netherlands showed that a system can be designed to protect the socially vulnerable. Expert evidence established that the predicted abuse and disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations has not materialized in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Oregon. Now, it's been almost a decade since since the Carter decision, since Canada's legalization. And since that time, there's also been a huge increase in the number of jurisdictions that have legalized assisted dying in some form. And we know consistently that the safeguards are effective at protecting vulnerable people. And despite what you hear about the kind of cases that come out of Canada, that most of those, as Dr. Green said, upon closer inspection are not really revealing what MAID opponents think that they're revealing. It's also the case that if we were there is a kind of strategy or an option available if we're really worried about some particular vulnerable group, that we could just ban assisted dying for people in that vulnerable group. So we could make it the case that if you don't have enough money, that you should not be able to access assisted dying. And that would take care of the problem. Now, I haven't yet come across anyone actually arguing for that. And the reason is it would be tremendously unjust. And MAID opponents, of course, I think see this. This is why they'll talk about vulnerability, but they'll never offer this strategy. And unfortunately, the kind of strategy that they do go for then is that we'll just ban MAID for everybody to avoid this problem is even more unjust. It's also the case that vulnerability, of course, isn't unique to MAID, even in end-of-life care. That people who are in hospice or people who are in ICUs, people who are considering the discontinuation of life-sustaining treatment, that they can also be pressured by family members. They can also be influenced in various ways. And once again, we need to be aware of those. In my work as a clinical ethicist, it's one thing I get consulted about, concerns about coercion from family members, for instance. But the fact that that can happen, that those cases exist, is not enough to say that, well, we should just ban hospice or ban end-of-life, discontinuing life-sustaining treatment at all. All right, so I don't think vulnerability arguments. I think what they justify is that we need to be aware of criteria, we need to be aware of safeguards, we can debate what the appropriate balance between access and restriction should be, but it doesn't follow that because there are vulnerable people, that therefore we are justified in a ban on MAID. And I think that this is also kind of a missed opportunity, because when I look at Canada, I think that there are serious issues. I think that healthcare waiting times are too long. I think that housing is too expensive. I think that social supports for people with disabilities are insufficient. And those are all things that I find that I tend to have common cause with, and for the types of people who make the vulnerability objections to assisted dying. But focusing on MAID, trying to ban MAID because of those factors, is missing how we're actually going to do the most amount of good. That if they were to succeed and ban MAID, all of those problems would still exist. They wouldn't do anything to solve those. And I think that that would be a serious tragedy. So thank you all very much.